when several of his classmates had either been killed or committed suicide. He was scared that the same thing would happen to them that happened to him. Ani bojo, wabshka nangon, nadishna cause, ngate dodem. Essentially, what I said is, hello, my name is White Star. That is my spirit name. I identify by it the most, and it guides me in my journey in life. And it's very important to me that I hold that part of me close. My name to others, however, when I don't share my spirit name, is just Aaron. And I am of the Otter clan. I am an indigenous, two-spirited trans woman. What that essentially means is that I am indigenous to Canada, or Turtle Island, as our people call it. I always had grown up in different settings than most other indigenous people. I was always close to my community, and I was born on the reserve, but I was only raised there for a year and a half before my family moved out to the country. We lived not too far from a township. This township is where I went to school. It's where most other kids from my reserve went to school. So I was able to see them a lot. But we were the minority. The school was mostly filled with non-native children who were part of settler families. My school life as a child was probably one of the most traumatizing experiences I had, because living in occupied land as an indigenous person and going to school with non-native children leads to a lot of cultural differences, and most times I would get bullied, or children wouldn't really know that I was indigenous because I was white passing. My father, he was white, but he was actually raised by an indigenous family because he was adopted by one when he was just a child. He participated in ceremonies, hosted some himself, and my mother herself, she is Chippewa, and so I am Chippewa First Nations. But I was lucky to be raised by my stepfather, who was Mississauga First Nations. He raised me on our culture, on our beliefs, and my mother helped as well. So I was very lucky to have been raised with my culture. A lot of Indigenous children in southern Canada aren't raised with their culture at all. More northern territories, they still keep on to their culture strongly, but they have very little access to clean drinking water, to affordable housing and necessities, and usually have to drive to get their groceries. When you live on a reserve of about 100 to 1,000 people, depends on the reservation, not everyone is going to have a car. So a lot of people go hungry in those reserves, and a lot of crime happens due to poor infrastructure and very little governmental support. But with school, for being in southern Canada, it was not normal to go to school. Our principal, our teachers, they would label us criminals because we were native, and they would group us together, say that you are this reservation kids, even if some were from a different one, and would treat us like the criminals they believed we were going to be. That wasn't a fun experience. And a lot of kids would see that and be like, oh, so you are a criminal. You're going to go to juvie. You're going to go to juvie. One kid did go to juvie because he was being harassed by a principal and he kicked her in the face. I didn't see him for months after that. He eventually came back. He was not the same since. It's difficult to understand why we were treated that way. And as I grew up more, I started to understand the extreme racism that exists within our systems. And I learned that through my interactions with medicine systems, law enforcement systems, and the educational system itself. In most schools, they teach you that Native peoples were extremely accepting of settlers, and that there were many agreements between us that are still honored today, and they do the land acknowledgements, but a lot of that is very, very untrue, and we live with that reality. I lived with the reality as a child. Our people heavily live with intergenerational trauma from residential schools and from the 60s school.
You mentioned the racism in the medical system. I know a lot of people always wonder, how can medicine be racist? Can you explain more about that?
Well, I imagine you've had talk with people from the Black community about this, and people from the United States, and the medical system is a lot different in Canada than it is in the U.S., but our healthcare is free. While it is free to go to a doctor to get a visit, they are paid per visit. So often a doctor will see you, tell you nothing's wrong with you, but to come back. They don't give a diagnosis. They don't normally give you the help you ask for. They tell you what you need. It gets worse when you're an Indigenous person. It's already bad, but it gets worse. You go in there, and if you tell them that you deal with addiction, they nod their head like, I thought so. And it's not just that, it's that they will often have a bias towards you already when you walk through that door, that you are there for drugs, that you are there for methadone, you're an alcoholic, or that you're trying to waste their time, or that you're going to get angry. So already they have this level of impatience with you when you walk in through the door. That's really difficult. It made me avoid the medical system for the longest time, even when I tried to get diagnoses for PTSD and other things. And I eventually did get those diagnoses because I have very intense childhood trauma, family trauma, school trauma, whatever. Asking for support after was always a conversation of what medication are you going to take. And then they would immediately go for some of the most addictive medicines there are. There's a medication I took for my bipolar type 1. It made me very apathetic. It made me feel like nothing. I didn't like that, so I stopped taking the medication. But a lot of other Native people have had it worse than me because I'm white passing. Doctors don't immediately know that I'm Native until they look at my records, until they see that I'm a status Indian. We have Indian status cards. I still have mine. I haven't updated it for years, but the number is still the same. It always stays the same. So I have this big number identifying me as a Native person or an Indian in the government's eyes. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has once divided us from Canadian citizens as the Indian people. There's a lot of problems with how the government handles the talks of reconciliation because Justin Trudeau's platform, when we all gave him our votes, started with the fact that he was going to give infrastructure and support to Native communities and help us with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls epidemic. We call it an epidemic because it's similar to our suicide epidemic, where so many people are just going missing or being found dead, and we don't get answers. We don't get answers, and he did not hold to any of the promises he made. And he continues to allow the pipelines to be built over stolen land and our current land that we have sovereignty over. In our treaty rights says that they cannot intrude on our spaces, and they build these pipelines right over our roads, our farms, and our drinking water. And we have oil leaking into so much of it. So people who already had very little drinking water are losing more. The medical problem starts from the top, starts from the government not giving proper infrastructure support to any of the systems they put in place. And then the RCMP, where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were created to control Indigenous populations and keep us in check.
Right.
I could say more about the medical industry, but again, other people have faced way worse than me, have straight up gotten thrown out the door for being Indigenous and have been refused pharmaceutical treatment, locked out of methadone clinics. And it's hard to find Indigenous doctors. It's hard to find anyone who trusts in traditional medicines for healing and traditional means of healing. And our own medicine people are completely labeled as useless and tribal and uncultured by many professionals and, Canadian citizens alike. Although a lot of modern medicine was influenced by native medicine, like syringes. We had our own before settlers had even come. We used thin bone needles with a hollow tube that would be attached to a animal bladder filled with medicine that would be used for vaccinations and other things. That was developed and made by the Cree people. And a lot of our culture revolved around the making and use of medicines and different agricultural techniques. Like, have you ever heard of permafarming? You sort of work with the land to provide the most bountiful resources you can in a way that keeps it renewing itself. Most national forests were our farms. We controlled the growth of trees in a way, the breeding of animals in a way, and the population of animals in a way. We could go to a location, take what we need, and it would renew itself.
Wow. I guess my question about the traditional medicine, I'm wondering, how does it interact with Western science-based medicine in a way that can effectively help people?
The two can coexist. Like we make teas and herbal poultices and such that can be the remedy for a number of different problems. And then ceremonial healing can be used for mental health and also support from elders and community. And community-based healing, but it depends on the problem you come with. If you have a headache, you might get a tea or a ceremony. And obviously, not a lot of it is a replacement for modern medicine. We still rely on a lot of modern medicines, but the two can absolutely coexist, and they should. Most Indigenous people just need that extra support from traditional ways of healing and community involvement.
It sounds like it's less trying to replace science, which is what a lot of people imagine it as, and more just trying to be a way to emotionally and psychologically support the science that we have already.
Yeah, and physically sometimes too. We actually had birth control as well. We still do, but people don't really know about it. Certain flowers, if combined in a certain way, can help with birth control.
That's fascinating.
It also helped with abortions as well for mothers who were not ready or were in a really bad situation and didn't want to have a child. Yeah, it's not a replacement, but it also shouldn't be ignored.
Yeah, if something works, then you should at least pay attention to it. And I'm guessing, like you said, a lot of it has to do with the fact that if you are doing something that is ceremonial or traditional to the people around you and to you, that creates a very positive psychological effect that's very real.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the biggest problem in indigenous communities right now is mental health support. And not a lot of people have it. I work with a company that is trying to start something right now that's going to offer a lot more mental health support to members in crisis. Right now, I mentioned the suicide epidemic. 40% of suicides in Ontario or Canada right now is 40% youth. That's 40% of all Canadian citizens that are committing suicide right now are very young adults. And a large amount of that, too, is indigenous youth. A lot of those youth are people who have been disconnected from their culture or don't have any way to get support from their culture. The isolation from the pandemic as well has been terrible for that. So it's only gotten worse. We have the man camps along the pipelines where workers are staying at near indigenous territories. More missing and murdered women have been reported around those areas, and nothing's being done about it. No one's looking into the workers. No one's looking into anyone involved with the pipeline. And we know that there's a link, but the police are giving nothing for us to prove it. So that situation has gotten worse, and it's been bad for many, many years. We've also had to sort of expand the title of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls to SMMIWG. So that includes Two-Spirited People. But we also are including men in it as well, because our men are getting ignored, and our non-binary family, because there's this very weird idea that Indigenous men don't have the same value as Indigenous women, but we all have equal value in our societies. There is no concept of like who is greater than the other. We are all equal. We are equal in spirit and in creation.
So you would say that the gender inequality that is kind of shown through the culture about Indigenous men is Western inherently. It didn't come from the culture. It was brought to it.
Yes, even our pronouns, like we have nene and kwe in our language now, but that was introduced by Western society.
Right, because gender was so much more complex in Indigenous cultures.
Very complex. I mean, I'm two-spirited. I have both a feminine and a masculine spirit, and I'm a trans woman. I identify with my masculine spirit a lot. I also connect heavily with that feminine spirit, too. And we take on the roles of those spirits. And that doesn't mean, a man is going to be doing man things. That means that somebody who's in touch with their masculine spirit is going to do the duties of community that spirit fits to. So, hunters and gatherers and stuff, they were pretty much anyone. And then healers were too. But like when you're a water protector, that's more in line with the feminine spirit, because water has a connection with the feminine. Protectors, they have a connection with fire, which also has a connection with the masculine. As to the spirited people, we go through different roles. We go through all roles within creation. And then many people, if they are not two-spirited, they can still fill a feminine role. It just means something different for them.
Right. Can you tell me more about the history of two-spiritedness? Because that's what really got me fascinated, was when you talked about kind of this new gender idea. If someone had come to me with, the idea of neo-genders from a Western perspective, I would have been a little bit more like critical of it. But when you brought it to me, I was like, oh, I know this is a thing. This is a cultural phenomenon that has existed for a long ass time. Like, this isn't someone on Tumblr came up with.
Yeah, no, like you said new earlier, and I was going to correct you, but you even corrected yourself. It's not new at all. It has been in our cultures for many, many, many generations. I'll use an example real quick. There was this two-spirited woman at the time who had begun receiving these visions and felt herself becoming a man. So she left for the mountains And she was gone for a long time, came back, was completely a man, came back a man in almost every way you can imagine, and stepped down into his territory and with his people, with his community. And they said, welcome back. They treated him no differently than they would anyone else. And he came back with these visions that he had while he was gone of settler nations coming, changing all of our values, all of our ways of life, displacing many of us. This was before colonization. This is in our oral recorded history. They said we are going to lose everything. And while he was with his community, he got married, and he and his wife left across Turtle Island to tell other nations about this vision. So many of us were pretty prepared so that when the time came, we had our treaties ready. And those treaties are still not being honored today. I live on unceded land, which is treaty territory. And unceded means that we never signed it over to the government. And yet I live in a city that is completely controlled and operated by the government, with every system you can think of being government enforced. Yeah, so it's our nation's land that is not being recognized as our own.
So much of Western ideology and mythos is based on this idea of fulfilling the individual's best abilities with what he owns, right? I say he because it's almost always a male in Western mythos and ideology, but it's like I hear you talk about just blatant robbery, and I just think, no, people only think that when it's convenient for them.
It is robbery. I mean, we had much of our land stolen by the crown. That still belongs to the crown. And our territories keep getting smaller and smaller. There were white women who married into Native families back in the day when this was still a thing by the Indian Act, where she would get a status card because she married into a Native family. She would start up a bunch of businesses in that territory and then sell that land to the government.
Literally infiltrating your communities.
Yes. And in my reserve, there are cottages all around that belong to non-native people. They all came in from the city I'm currently living in. So
just like rich people buying land because they want to have land on a reserve?
Yeah, and then they come in like every few months to stay in their cottages, and then they call the cops on a lot of our children because they're saying they're being criminals in the streets, and all they're doing is hanging up by an abandoned house. There's a lot of abandoned houses in some of our reserves. Kids can't be kids on our reserves because the cottagers will call the cops on them. It happened to my brother and my adopted brother.
Can you tell me more about how adoption and the idea of raising a child under a parental system is different in Western and Native cultures?
I call it the continued 60s scoop because it hasn't ended. Native children are still being stolen from their families by CAS. And my partner is here, and they've given me permission to talk about this. They're a survivor of the continued 60s scoop. Their mother was not able to fully support them. And so the government, actually, the CAS is not a government-owned organization. It's an independent business.
That's a business that's able to do that.
It's a business, and it is funded by the government. They came to my partner's mother, saw that she was not doing well at all. It was actually a very bad situation, but they were not given to a Native family. They were put from place to place to place, foster family to foster family, and it was always foster families, no one adopted. That alone, going back and forth from house to house and from their own mother to their foster family, gave them CPTSD and RAD, reactive attachment disorder. That alone would have been a lot if it weren't for the fact that they were given to a foster family that was the family of a woman who had stolen their mother from her own family.
Oh, wow.
And their brother. Yes, these three sisters in this one family had stolen multiple children from different families from that woman who is my partner's mother. So all of her children got displaced amongst all of these three sisters. And my partner ended up alone with their current foster family, and they are not in contact with them anymore. They are a white family, very rich, and appropriated indigenous culture a lot, did not let them be raised on traditional values. So they had an extreme disconnect with their own culture for years. Since they were 6 years old, they've known.
Wow.
Yeah, they didn't get to properly connect with it. Taken when they were 4.
That is horrific. Oh my God.
Yesterday, we went to a powwow. I was working that day because it was my company that was organizing the event. I was dealing with a lot of children because I was helping with the youth programming to facilitate activities and such for youth and children. And my partner wasn't volunteering, so they're just there to enjoy the powwow, but they are disabled and were overwhelmed by the noise and the fact that there were children around them who were connecting with their culture when they didn't get a chance to when they were young. And they felt extremely isolated because no one was talking to them. And I tried to talk to them sometimes, but would be pulled away for my work. And I tried to step away for them for like an hour and a half. And then my company was like, you got to get back to your team right now. We understand that your partner is a little overwhelmed, but they didn't understand the half of it. So we go back. And then my partner tells me I'm feeling extremely not okay right now. Like, I'm not okay. Like, this is really bad. I'm surrounded by so much that I just can't connect with. I can't go anywhere because I'm in so much pain. And I had to bring them to a harm reduction tent and say they need some support right now from a crisis responder. And so my boss comes over and he's like, hey, what's going on? And I tell him, and he says, okay, forget about going back to your team. This is what we do, right? We support our community. You stay with them. Crisis response, that's when somebody is having a mental health crisis in our community and our team goes out to support them. That's what I needed from my partner in that moment. When people from my team were telling me that I couldn't just spend time with them at the powwow. And so I saw that while we are connecting with our traditional values and while we are, supporting our community in our own ways, we are also not considering the impact we are having on our own workers and our own families when we don't connect with what we're doing.
That's like such a different idea to how we would consider work culture here. Like, when you're needed, your work comes first before anything else on earth.
My partner really needed me in that moment, and that's exactly what was happening too. My work comes first. But I was so relieved when my boss told me that I could go and support them. I'm actually going into crisis response work myself.
Oh,
A lot of what I'm going to be doing with other people.
that's amazing.
I'm still in training, and I wasn't the person who needed to help my partner in that moment. I'm so glad that my team was there for them. But we had to leave after because, they still didn't feel well. And I was allowed to go home. I was allowed.
You said that it was a harm reduction tent. Is that something that is often at events, or is it just something you can get to easily?
They are now, where our team is basically starting that. Harm reduction tent, it has our team of responders in it, where they are ready with water, maybe with some food and other different drinks. And they have nurses on standby as well. And they patrol the powwow grounds to make sure that everyone is okay. And if it looks like anybody is having a mental health crisis in that moment, they will bring them over and give them support.
That sounds like it would just make any environment better. Like, that just sounds like a thing humans should do.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our work is to not demonize mental health either. Because, like somebody could be angry, yelling at a bunch of people. And our work is to help that person, to get them what they need. But first we have to have a conversation with them, What do you need? What do you want? Can I get you something to eat? We give them choices and they respond with their answers, and we give follow-up support now. That's what we're doing for our community. And that work already existed, but now we are running this in our way, in a traditional way, in a community-based way. And we're doing it with a company that is run by and for the Black community as well, because our communities have supported each other for generations. Because we have both faced this systemic oppression, this racial violence, and have been denied access to a lot of the systems that we need for support. So we're giving that.
Or denied proper access as well. A lot of systems say that they're there for you and just aren't when they are for everyone else.
There is a big problem with bias and stuff in the medical community among doctors, but nurse practitioners are amazing people. And more often than not, they do what crisis responders do. What do you need? And they listen. They actually listen instead of saying, here's what I think you need. Here's what I know you need. You say you're disabled, but I know it's just because you're this and this. You're not doing enough of this. But a nurse practitioner will say, okay, so you are experiencing pain in your joints. Let's look into that. We really should have more of is harm reduction.
Definitely. I mean, there's so many ways that we can implement harm reductive ideology and kind of theory into how we do medicine that people just aren't okay with, that are in power, both in America and in Canada. I mean, how in the Scandinavian countries and other parts of Europe, they have harm reduction centers for people that are facing addiction. They don't consider it to be a crime. They consider it to be a mental disorder. They consider it something that you're experiencing, not something you're doing to the world.
Yeah, exactly. We don't even call it addiction. We call it substance use. If you were to say that you're addicted, then I'd be like, okay, all right. So you consider yourself that. In my mind, it's a substance user or a person who has a dependency on substances. We do everything we can in our language and in our work to not demonize or criminalize the behavior and the use of substances. I wish a lot of more people would see somebody who is in crisis and think, well, why are they? And what do they need?
Definitely.
Instead of saying, this person is in my space, they're making me upset.
That's what a lot of American and I'm guessing is also Canadian justice system does. It's very punitive. It's how do I fight back against this problem, not how do I find the root cause of it. It's why American prisons are basically the most lucrative business you can get, keeping people for as cheap as possible, as long as possible, and getting paid by the government to do it, not figuring out what's wrong or fixing it.
Yeah, my partner just said prisons are slave labor. We have a big association with that because in the law enforcement system, a lot of indigenous people that go into prisons are people who have either never committed a crime or were convicted of the wrong crime or were given a more harsh sentence than somebody who was not native who committed the same crime would have gotten. And then they are put to work in the prison. My stepfather, he went in for minor legal infractions. He got into a bar fight. It was pretty bad. He did roll with a biker gang for a while, and they've shown up at our house a few times. He went in this time for minor legal infractions. I think he was there for 6 months when the sentence should have been 2. He came back super exhausted because the whole time he was there, he was making products for companies. They say it's rehabilitation, that they're going to be put back into society, but most of the clothes you get, or most of like the handheld items you get that are like, they say they're made in China and stuff, they're made in prison. My pa, he's like, wow, some of the stuff I make, I've bought. I bought in stores. I bought it for myself, for my family. This is stuff that I made. Something that I have right now, I probably made in a prison. They don't get paid while they're in the prison for working hours a day, making thing after thing after thing, license plates too. I've never been to prison, thank God. My stepfather would kick my ass if I did, but I know that I would have family in there that would protect me if I was. Do you know how fucking crazy that is to say, by the way? If I went to prison, I would have family that would look out for me. That's insane. I have family that are still in there. And yeah, they look out for me. They make sure that nobody hurt me or nobody tried to manipulate me or anything. But they wouldn't be able to do much against the guards because they get the same treatment. My grandfather, my papa, he's on my mother's side. He married a woman of Italian descent, my Nona, or Noni, as she liked to be called. But he himself, he was Chippewa, and he was a residential school survivor. I want to put this out there. A lot of residential schools, when they were ended, some were still going on in secret. Some of them were called instead day schools for Native children, or Indian children, they said. I'm First Nations, and there are many nations within Turtle Island. These day schools, some of them still exist. A lot of them were ended, but they were still causing major trauma within several children who were being taken from their homes and put into these schools. And when the residential schools were at their worst, my papa happened to be one of the children who went there instead of to a foster home. So most children would be taken from their families, divided from each other, put into schools, or with a white family. It would have been fine if most of them had went to maybe like an Irish family or something, but it was usually British settlers or French. So my papa, he survived residential school when several of his classmates had either been killed or committed suicide because of the nuns and the teachers who were there, who would make them scrub their skin if they were too dark, saying they're tainted by the devil, who would hurt them for speaking their own language, and would traumatize these children into speaking English only, forgetting their own values, cutting their hair short. And hair is so important in our culture. We grow our hair long to connect with spirit and to connect with each other and to honor ourselves and our relations. And I grow my hair long, and I try to take care of it really well because, that is my connection. So he didn't really know anything after he got out, and he turned to alcohol as a way to cope with the stress and the trauma. He tried his best to be a happy man for his family when he married my Noni. He wouldn't teach them anything. He wouldn't teach them a single thing. Not the language, not the traditional values, not anything, because he was scared that the same thing would happen to them that happened to him. So my mother went without her culture, but she was able to connect to it through other family and through friends that she had at the time. She didn't even have as deep of a connection as I have now. And that's because she was scared too. She didn't know the language. I barely do. I know my introductions. I know my basic words. Mise, our grandfather teachings. I know our traditional medicines. I know the 4 sacred medicines, different ceremonies and practices. And I know that our cultures vary from nation to nation. As a Chippewa person, I speak Ojibwe language. My partner is Mohawk and speaks Kanian Kehaka. They know more Japanese and Russian because they are also of mixed ancestry, and they have their grandmother was Japanese.
Mm.
Yeah, if you know Connor Kenway from Assassin's Creed, he's Mohawk. They really like Connor Kenway. I have known I was Native since longer than I can remember. I grew up knowing that I was different from most of the children in my school, that I had a name that nobody could pronounce. So I had to go by the one that was the English one. I knew that we had intergenerational trauma since the age of 6. I knew that my papa had been a residential school survivor since the age of 8. I started learning our ceremonies at the age of 7. And again, that is something I was lucky to have more than a lot of other Native children. And some are lucky to be able to completely speak the language. Have you heard of the Lakota Nation? They had a organization come into their land, speak with their elders and their community members to gather and collect data on their language and to completely restore it. Completely restore it, had a whole library of all the ways of speaking the language and tried to sell it to the Lakota people. Would not give them access to it at all. They said, you want this, you have to buy it because we did the work.
Jesus.
So yeah, they stole their language from them and said, you can have this for the price of like, I forget the number, but it was huge. For a lot of my relations, their culture was stolen from them. Our people are survivors of a cultural genocide. And a lot of indigenous people in the US face almost a complete genocide. Entire nations wiped off the face of the map. Actually, you know what's really whack? If you look at a map of the US, it will show reservation, right? It will show the territory of reservations. If you look at Canada, it doesn't. You gotta search up a reservation that you know of to find it. They erase us in Canada. In the US, they take a step back and say like, oh well, they're still here. You know, we didn't do too much. And then in Canada, they pretend like we don't exist. And when we come out and we practice our ceremonies in public, we are told to go home and to leave. And we say we are home. We're right here. This is our home. We're on our territories. We are practicing our values. And people think that reconciliation and sovereignty means getting rid of everyone that's in our land, but that's not it. We can coexist. We have before. We had overseas relations for colonization. We had trade with, I believe, with China, and we had trade with Japan, had trade with some European countries. The Scandinavian nations, they came long ago and had relations with us. There were Irish settlers too. And they didn't try to turn us away from our own culture. They tried to embrace it. And that's all we ask, is that people embrace our culture as we embrace yours, that we celebrate each other in the space that we share. Because we already shared our space with other nations within Turtle Island. Like, I am indigenous, but I'm not the same as the Haudenosaunee, but we shared our land with each other. We're all one mind, one body, one spirit. We also have a belief that, trees and rocks and animals and plants and all beings of creation have a spirit within them that must be honored and valued. And so when we do something like crossing water or taking something from the land, we give tobacco to it, one of our 4 sacred medicines, to honor that spirit. And you make something from that gift, it's no longer alive. It no longer has a spirit, but it still has that association with it, that responsibility of having given it a gift to take from it. And if you give that to someone else, they take in that responsibility too. We had a trade system that was based on gift giving. We lost that because, money is the most important thing, apparently.
I read about the gift economy through a book called The Gift of Strawberries. An indigenous woman wrote it.
There's so many differences in the way that we viewed trade than Western society does. Because money exchange is based on the work you've done, right? Gift giving is that. It's a gift. We gave the Taino people, when Columbus first arrived, gave gifts to them and the settlers, not because they thought they were some alien gods, because they said, oh, more traders. We're going to give them gifts. They will give us gifts. And the trade will flow. And then we can start conversation. And then they gave them this declaration that said, if you don't agree to our terms, we're going to war. They had no witness with them, and the Taino people could not read it. So on the day of the agreement, they were forced into a war that they had no idea they were being told was going to happen. Have you heard of the Declaration of Discovery when colonization first happened? Basically, it was this declaration to all settlers that any unoccupied land they came across was theirs to claim. They considered land owned by indigenous people to be unclaimed land and territory. So if there were any Native people within that settlement, this mostly happened in the US, that's why I mentioned genocide, they would kill the people living there. And they would continue to kill those who would try to take the land back. In Canada, it was kind of a different story. They honored our treaties. I'm trying to air quote. It's hard to with this. but they tried to honor our treaties by signing with us, saying, yeah, we agree, and then slowly pushing us out and away and saying, oh, well, we agreed that this is our land now. And we say, no, we did not. We did not agree to that. We have several wampum agreements that state our terms, that if you break it in this way, then we cannot have relations, that we cannot have trade, that you are not honoring the treaties that we signed with each other. And they ignore it. They still ignore it to this day. I don't even have all the information that most other people do when we speak about the land back movements and the treaties, right? That's difficult because, I want to advocate for our own people. But, sometimes people ask me, like, well, do you know about this and I'm like, not really. I'm going to learn. I have to, right?
You've done an amazing job of making it abundantly clear just how screwed over everyone in your past, including yourself, has been. You've gotten the point across very well, and I hope that the people watching at home get the point too.
These are talks that we need to have. They're difficult talks. But you want to be an ally or you want to honor the treaty lands that you live on, then reconciliation is going to go a long way if more people understand that land acknowledgements do not equal reconciliation. You can say all you want that I recognize I live on this land of this and this. But if you don't make the effort to help those people be comfortable in their own lands, actions mean more than words. And that's what we want from our government, That's what we largely want from the systems that are saying we will uphold our land acknowledgements and treaties, and they don't.
Is there anything that I, as an individual living in America, can do to help?
Just advocate. Let the indigenous voices be at the top of their own movements. Don't speak over their voices, but help them speak louder. Because, again, actions mean way more than words.
Tell me a story, I wanna hear it. You might think it's boring,